everybody. Thanks for coming. So just as people are coming in, as I said in the first just bullet point there, what we're going to be talking about is nature. And to help us with just a point coming up later, we're really interested just if, as you're coming into the chat, as you're coming into to pop into the chat, what it is you think about when you think about the word nature. So what pops into your mind? You know, don't overthink it, just go with your gut. So when you hear the word nature, natural world, outdoors, just pop into your head, pop into the chat, sorry, what comes to mind. And I will come back to that point in a bit later. So what I'm going to cover over the next half an hour is a very brief introduction, let's say like a whistle-stop tour. This is how I often start presentations, is to lower everybody's expectations. So then that lowers and manages my anxieties, because this is a huge research area. And what I'm hoping to give you is just a little flavor of what I've found so far, why I think it's super interesting and why I think EPs should be talking about this a little bit more. But you will not by the end of by no means be completely au fait and kind of, up to date on the research, but you will be left with some helpful places of where to go next for some more information. And hopefully we'll have a chance at the end for me to hear your thoughts and your ideas and, learn from each other about kind of what we might already be doing with thinking about the natural world. I'm not going to tell you my life story, but the reason that these other points are here on my opening slide is just so that you can be clear that I'm coming this from a personal interest. So this has not been much of it's not my professional experience has not really led me to this point of thinking about research, which is contrary to what tends to happen. So I'm doing the top-up doctorate with UCL, started in January 2019, and it's still going. I do actually have participants, so that's exciting. That was a major hurdle. And I'm now slowly wading through thematic analysis. So if anyone wants to stay afterwards and help me understand that would be really much appreciated. The reason I mention this is it's because it's come from a personal interest. I have a personal bias in this. So because I'm doing thematic analysis and I'm aware of, trying to be a reflexive thematic analysis, I want to be kind of clear about the personal bias that I have. I love the outdoors. I love outside. I love I'm the kind of person who would drag my kids up and down hills. It hasn't really come up much in work, except for a little bit of like in my previous EP role in Bristol, a couple of my schools would use forest school. And one setting I had, a nursery, an inner city nursery, asked to use some of their EP time to see if I could do observations about the impact of forest school on some of their students or littlies with social communication difficulties. And so did a primary school a few years later. So I had a few little bits of professional experience of thinking about the outdoors. But by the time I came to do my top-up doctorate, and as I was saying to Nicole and Sarah earlier, I was still convinced that my area of interest was so niche that on my application form, I said I wanted to do something else for my thesis. And it was only until I came for my interview and I said, actually, what I really want to do is look at the impact of nature on our well-being and seeing what we can learn from that, fully expecting them to take kind of a deep intake of breath, but actually they took it very seriously. I felt very validated, and off I went with my starting question. So first of all, I was interested to find out, is there any evidence? So I have my personal feeling that being outdoors is good for me and my family, my children, but actually, is this just because I like it? Is there any evidence out there to suggest that it can have an impact on our well-being and other areas of human functioning? And my other question then was, well, if there is any evidence, what could we as EPs been doing? What could we be doing with that information? Because at the time, I thought it was just me who was interested in this, and I thought I was kind of way out there. There wasn't a lot of EPs talking about it. So hopefully I can kind of get on to the next slide. My first question, was there any evidence? So very briefly, yes, there was loads. Found in a wide range of academic fields like epidemiology, geography, town planning, environmental psychology, eco-psychology, clinical psychology, we're looking at it. However, as we said, and I'm going to kind of open the chat now, in terms of what you think about when you think about nature. So yeah, we've got bird sound, green, freshness, healthy, invigorating. Okay, so that's about the kind of the benefit that it gives to you: sunshine, trees, water, fresh air, waves, freedom. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we can think about nature. Squirrels, and as you can imagine, you know, in the research, that's quite a thing to get around. So nature in the research that I've come across so far could be a walk in the park. It could be gardening. It could be surfing. We think we had a presentation at one of the EP, the D Outside blogs there day. There was a psychologist talking about surf therapy up in Scotland and in Australia. In the States, there's wilderness camp. So and you know, the other studies had looked at kind of views from a window or hearing sounds of nature. So it's a wide area, very not neatly defined, and it means many things to different people. The other, so the research, it just, you know, as I said, I won't be kind of summarizing it in total for you, but these guys, Berman et al., helpfully categorized it in kind of 3 broad types of research. And I thought that might be interesting for you guys just to think about how broad, I suppose, the research is. So there's research that's looking at the tiny, minute level of detail of nature. So looking at the impact of the difference of having like straight lines versus being kind of in the built world versus curved lines or, you know, soft edges. So that's what they call kind of looking at the micro level. That's also research looking at the impact of like sounds, or just a very tiny, breaking down nature into its tiniest details, trying to understand what it is about nature that humans respond to or don't. Then they talk about a meso level of evidence, where there's kind of like, I don't know, maybe 20 to 40 participants. And these types of studies tend to have some sort of type of interaction with nature, and then pre and post measure. So in one of the examples I'll mention later, that's something that uses attention, of children's attention, and then there might be a walk in the park, a walk around the street, and then there'll be a post measure. Sometimes there's a control group, but they're very rarely kind of randomized to group. And then the other studies we'll come across that are in this field will be described as being at the macro level. So like large populations, so talking about sample sizes of thousands, and those types of study look at amount of nearby nature, which they judge like on doing really clever things, but like satellite data, and they link that to things like outcomes such as like SDQ scores. So there was a study from Barcelona that I'll mention that did that, and so those studies, as you can imagine, are largely correlational. So they're not looking at a cause; they're just linking proximity to green spaces, or amount of green space nearby, and then other outcomes like, you know, as you can imagine, physical ones like asthma, or levels of physical health, or as I'll show in this brief example a bit later, strengths and difficulties questionnaire scores for children and young people with or without a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So quite a lot of variation in the research. So there is a lot out there. So it's kind of narrowing it down to our world, and Aoife's is kind of what's needed. So what was missing then was kind of my next question in terms of, I suppose, you're thinking of this through my doctoral journey, is there wasn't a lot about young people's perspectives, which we as EPs are quite good at and quite keen on, and we recognise the importance of, except I did find a couple of exceptions, and one I wanted to highlight because it was done by educational psychologists. So again, the link with Forest School, there was 2 EPs in educational child psychology back in 2017 looked at young people with autism and the impact of Forest School. And a more recent one, which I've kind of tried to base my kind of what I do with my study on, is these guys, Birch et al., looked at young people in these art and kind of workshops in a more qualitative study about kind of exploring how young people construct nature. So there is a bit of that out there, but it's not the dominant let's say, type of research that's out there. So that's a gap. In terms of what else is missing, I suppose I've kind of contextual research. So thinking about like the situations that us as EPs tend to work in, schools. So there's a lot more stuff I found tends to be early years or primary school based, not a lot in secondary schools. And then again, more again in universities, possibly because psychology, universities need kind of graduates they have graduates on tap for studies, possibly, so possible convenience sampling going on there. So there's also then a gap of kind of having data on adolescents, around the age of 14 to 19-ish, and that's interesting. So I'll go on to mention why in a bit. And as I said, there's kind of a bit of a lack of randomized controlled trials. So the kind of rigor, I suppose, which people kind of, which is being held up as being, maybe kind of more rigorous example, or kind of in terms of looking at experiments to see the actual effect. So if you're wanting to look at causation, does being in nature actually cause something? Can we say it was down to being nature? There isn't a huge amount of those. And also longitudinal studies seem to be not as dominant. So a lot of the studies I've come across so far tend to be pre and post. So pre an intervention, and then the intervention itself isn't that long, particularly if it's a UK-based one. The American ones can tend, if they're about, wilderness camp, will be weeks on interventions, but that's not most of the research here. So there's very little kind of follow-up or kind of tracking across a lifespan. There's some lifespan ones, but they're done retrospectively, kind of thinking about adults reflecting back on their previous relationships with nature. As one of the studies I've come across goes on to mention, there's not a lot of other cultural perspectives being represented. So a lot of the research to date is from, let's say, Western or Northern, the global North, and Asia. So there's quite a lot of research coming from Asia. And I think from what I can tell so far, a lot of that is because of there's that what's the word, field of kind of interest in Shirin Yoku, so forest bathing. So there's quite a lot of research coming from Asia around that in terms of looking at the physiological impact, and I'll mention that. So first of all, though, we are psychologists. So where is the psychology in all of this? So I'm going to give you a brief whiz through of the kind of the key psychological theories that I've come across. There is a bit more, but I've just pulled out 4. Just to kind of remind ourselves, and also to remind me, because I like kind of get carried away with the idea of being out in nature being good for us. But where is the psychology? What's going on here? So one kind of, I suppose, one of the one I come across the most often is the biophilia hypothesis. So this was proposed by Kellert and Wilson, and the idea of the biophilia hypothesis, in brief, is that humans have evolved to be in tune with nature. So we, this is drawing on our evolutionary psychology, where we were, lived outdoors, we lived in caves, we had to survive kind of nature, we had to be aware of nature. And then as we've, developed farming and moved into agriculture, we had to be aware of the passing of the seasons, time of day. We spent most of our time outdoors, but now as our lives have become more industrialized in certain parts of the world, of course, not everywhere, we're perhaps spending more of our time indoors, and we're having less of that natural connection. And this is what's causing, they suggest, some ill health and a kind of disconnect from nature. Attention restoration theory, which came from Kaplan, suggests that being in nature enables what they call soft fascination. So the idea of soft fascination, is, as I understand it, is the idea that when you're outside in nature, so in our lives from day to day, we have to make a conscious effort to kind of focus on things like work and a task that's in front of us. When you're out in nature, you don't have to make a conscious effort to focus on things. You just look at it. So unless you're like on the cliff edge or you're, walking around tree roots, you're usually able to just look without kind of consciously focusing your attention. And so they suggest, or Kaplan suggested, that this soft fascination tops up our ability to then engage in focused attention tasks. And there's kind of some evidence in the research to support this, which I'll go on to mention. Stress reduction theory from Ulrich simply suggests that being in nature leads to positive emotions, so that just reduces our stress. And the thinking behind perceptual fluency theory is that, and it's quite similar to attention restoration theory, but they say that nature is just easy for our senses to process. Senses, all of our senses. And so therefore that increases positive emotions. And then the stress reduction and the attention restoration is just byproducts of this. The fourth concept I thought you guys might be interested in is this idea of nature connectedness or nature relatedness, also called kind of nature connectedness or nature connection. So it's a proposed psychological trait. Whether this is fixed or can be malleable is something that, is kind of yet to be clear to me. But the idea is that this is the extent to which we feel connected to the natural world. So it's not simply that being out in nature leads to benefits, but actually the idea to which you feel part of nature and the extent to which you feel kind of that you and nature are part of the same system, and that's kind of on a sliding scale. And so that the sense to which you feel actually connected to what's going on around you, that's thought to kind of mediate the relationship. So we're thinking about what's going on between being out in nature and improvements in well-being. Some people suggest that it's this idea of nature connection, and got a link to Richardson in my notes at the end, which I can send on to people because he's got a really interesting blog. So the people at the University of Derby have a whole research area on this idea of nature connectedness, and they've done lots of work on this. And I'm basing kind of quite a lot of my study on his study or their study, as I mentioned. So just as like a brief summary. So when I started, as I said, I've come to this through doing the top-up doctorate. And my first question was, is there actually any research, or is this just something I think is nice? Found loads of research and just very loosely kind of put them into these areas of outcomes that they were looking at, because I thought that might be of interest. So there's been studies that look at kind of impact on academic results. Not as many of those. Some studies have looked at the impact of contact with nature on attention control and impulse control, and I will talk about that a little bit more because I did focus one of my assignments on that. There's another kind of branch of studies that look at the impact, the physiological impact, and that can, a subset of that is like looking at physical health. So some studies have been looked at the difference of doing physical activities inside versus outside. But also, as I mentioned before, with like that whole field of research around forest bathing. So some studies have looked at like measuring cortisol levels and heart rate, blood pressure. So they're looking at kind of physiological markers of kind of the impact of nature on us, and have found, that there's like lower blood pressure and as a result of kind of time spent in forests. And then I've put down so mental health in the kind of the broadest sense of kind of well-being. So there's a group of studies that are kind of looking at the impact of nature on adult well-being and also children and young people's well-being. And a little bit that kind of focus on social emotional skills. So measures of like the SDQ and things like that. And then other groups of research have been looking at what they call pro-environmental behaviors in their own right. So, well, I kind of went into this thinking, would it be interesting if, we can show that nature has an impact on our well-being. There's other kind of, given the current situation that we're in with a climate crisis and climate breakdown, there's a growing field of research of looking at how can we use psychology and nature connection and these ideas to try and encourage increased pro-environmental behaviors among young people. So that's, and that's not based on a kind of an exhaustive trail through the literature. This is what I've noticed and kind of how I'm broadly categorizing these kind of topics as I've gone through since I started. Nature and attention control. So kind of very briefly, so this, because I think this is worth just looking at in a little bit of detail, because this is an area that could directly apply to our work. There's a couple of studies, well, quite a few, sorry, more than a couple, but I just mentioned 3 in detail that looked at it, how contact with nature could impact our attention control. And so the first one, very small sample size, So as I mentioned, this is kind of one of the issues coming up with the research. But they used digit span backwards, and they did before and after measures of using digit span backwards, comparing them with a walk in the neighborhood versus with a walk in the residential area versus a walk in the park. And then they found that the digit span backward scores following the walk in the park were significantly better than the control groups. On the macro scale, then these guys in Barcelona that I mentioned before found that proximity to green spaces was statistically significantly related to lower scores on the SDQ at home, but not in school, interestingly. And then what prompted me to write this blog was this Mason et al.'s a systemic review of looking at exposure to what they call short-term exposure to nature and benefits to students. And so they've concluded from their review of the literature that this could be a not even low cost, but no cost opportunity to sustain students' cognition in a break in a green environment after mentally demanding activity. So this is very relevant to our world. Nature and well-being, because I knew this obviously would be a particular interest of mine. I haven't looked at this in a systematic way yet, but I've been gathering bits as I go and just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of systematic reviews. So Tillman and Al looked at it in 2018. I found 35 papers in which there was like 100 reported outcomes, and almost half reporting a statistically significant positive relationship between contact with nature and well-being. The rest were non-significant, and only one study found a negative relationship. And there is a little bit out there that I have made a note to come back to, of like especially for me, who might get carried away with the idea of, oh, there's all this research, let's get everybody outside. But there is some studies that talk about the kind of I suppose the opposite of biophilia, which is biophobia, or just the kind of the very practical and understandable negative aspects of being out in nature. And it's a useful reminder to people like me that it's not always a positive experience for young people. And this is kind of one of the things that's coming up a little bit in the data that I'm going through at the moment for my own study. Then, very recent, hot off the press, systematic literature review looking at of nature connectedness in particular on children's well-being, and they found 23 qualitative and quantitative studies. And what's interesting is that the output of research has really increased since 2016, and they've concluded that that we can say that there is a correlation between nature connectedness and well-being, but as we mentioned at the start, nature is such a diverse concept. There's so many different ways of kind of looking at it, and so there's kind of it's quite a wide field. So they're not necessarily always in reviews comparing like with like, and which I thought was quite interesting, that they note that further research is needed, thinking about like for different cultures and backgrounds and economic groups, because one of the things I've come across in kind of reading is that access to the natural world and to nature is not equal for all people, at all times. And that's something that as EPs we need to be aware of. Okay, I'm just going to briefly mention this because this is what was a springboard from my research. So the University at Derby, the team there have created their own scale for measuring nature connectedness. And that's what I'm using in my research. And why I focus on it is that there's this dip. When they were standardizing their measure, they reported, oh, isn't it interesting how this seems to dip in the teenage years? What does this mean? I wondered, as some people were tempted to link this with, the current increasing concerns about mental health and well-being in the teenage years. I think as EPs, we have to kind of be careful and cautious and bring to what we know about, adolescent development to bear on research like this. But I thought, oh, this is interesting. And that's why I'm kind of exploring that with the research that I'm doing at the moment. So, which brings me on to my caution. So that headline is from a New York Times article that was written during COVID-19. Some of you might have come across and be familiar with this book, The Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. So as a parent and as a lover of nature, I read this going, yes, absolutely. I'm right there with you, Richard Louv. However, he said himself that nature deficit disorder is not meant to be a medical term. However, this headline, suggests that perhaps there is a danger of, perhaps over medicalizing this and pathologizing and kind of what could be typical adolescent development. So, this is where we as EPs bring to bear great skills in here. And even kind of within the literature that's looking at the benefits of nature, there's a bit of medical language kind of sneaking in there. So I kind of used my Mendeley to look at the word dose, and that brought me 8 papers, you know, of kind of what I found as thinking about, you know, nature as a dose, which then leads on to, so as well as the medicalizing concern that gives me, it's also leads on to, which I can't go into, but like I thought would point you in the direction of this kind of discourse about the concerns about the commodification of nature. So seeing nature as something that we access to help us, and just concerns that people have around that concept. Sorry, I kind of know I am kind of rushing towards the end. So what can education psychologists do with this information? As I mentioned, we need to kind of bring our critical evaluation skills. So as you know, this is kind of my journey as somebody who's very keen on this idea, but also I'm needing to bring my EP hat on and using my EP head and thinking, okay, well, who does this work for, and in what circumstances and for whom? There's research skills that we have that we could be really useful to kind of bring into the field. So at the moment, EPs are kind of missing from the field of research about looking at nature and kind of looking at in the context in which we tend to operate, i.e. schools. I mean, there was one exception, so Pearson and Howe 2017 were involved in playground redesign, which echoed another study that I found, an Austrian study where, you know, playground redesign was used and they looked at kind of impact on well-being. That's something that educational psychologists be well placed to do. We just also need to bring our kind of knowledge about, you know, child and adolescent development and working at different systems, kind of the person-centered practices, which is where my kind of query about where are children's voices in all of this. More specifically, I've had some initial wonderings about things that maybe we could be doing with this information. So, you know, in our consultations, when we're gathering information from parents, from schools, we could be thinking about if questions are made about, oh, you know, like comments like, you know, they're so much better when they're outside, oh, they love break time, or, you know, when we're off going for walks on the beach at the weekend, you know, we don't have any of these issues. So what, you know, what is kind of, you know, what does nature mean for this particular child and family? Where do they access it? You know, you know, what, you know, day to day, do we notice a difference? For, you know, children that we're supporting with. Thinking about the school day, can we, and the schools that we're supporting, could we support and encourage our schools to make more use of their natural surroundings? Where is nature in the curriculum? I mean, that's a bigger discussion and a bugbear of mine. Could we be incorporating nature into our interventions? There's definitely loads of resources out there for teachers and PSE leaders in terms of how we can kind of adapt and make more use of the natural world in interventions that might be happening anyway. The stuff about attention restoration, I think we could certainly be kind of sharing with schools. Could schools happen? How could schools make best use of that? You know, this, you know, the school day depletes children's, you know, requires such focus for children. We know some children get movement breaks, but could that be enhanced by access to green space? As EPs, we always need to be thinking about barriers for some children and young people to accessing green spaces. So we need to be aware of that and asking questions, you know, for the families and schools and the that we support. Are there, you know, different opportunities, and how can schools maybe be thinking around how can they kind of, you know, get around some of the barriers for children and young people so that about green spaces can be accessed. And another kind of specific idea is that you might have heard of kind of social prescribing through the NHS, but certain areas of Britain have been given funding for green social prescribing. Bristol was one of them. So a specific thing you might be able to do is find out if there's one in your area, and I put a link to kind of finding out a bit more about that, and they might welcome, you know, EPs kind of to be involved. Okay. So we had a few questions. We asked for questions beforehand, and we had a few, and I just wanted to kind of, and before we kind of open, because I can see there's more in the chat, which I will look at in a second, but hopefully the first question was dealt with in the previous slide, but that's just my initial thinking. I'd be really interested to hear other people's ideas, which hopefully we will have time for. Interesting idea about EPs involved in kind of creating spaces, like physical spaces, and as I mentioned, there's that I've just put a link to that study that was done in Austria. So there, you know, there is previous research to look at kind of how the design of a space could be thought about so that it leads to more restorations. They were thinking about it through the perspective of attention restoration theory. Yeah, that has been done. Wasn't a perfect study, but it did show some positive effects. And then thinking about, so someone else has asked about kind of nature-based walks as an intervention. I'd be really interested to know if anybody was doing that. I had a quick look on Google, and there is some research out there. And just finally to kind of mention as well, like if making the link between nature and well-being, you might be aware of that the New Economics Foundation 5 Ways to Wellbeing study. Nature was in there, didn't make the short list, but it was on the long list. So there is it kind of just adds to our growing body of evidence. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I've gone slightly over, and I just want to make sure that I've got time to get through the kind of, because I can see there's things in chat. So I'm going to stop sharing, Sarah, and have a look. Oh, Sarah's brilliant. Okay. Oh, I love the book. It's had Last Child in the Woods. Okay, any other particular questions or reflections? EPs can be involved in the ergonomics of building schools. Yeah, and I don't think they'd think to ask us, but I think that's something we can certainly be involved in based on the bit that I've read. So a walking, talking therapy practice in London using green spaces around. Oh, that sounds really interesting. Would you be able to say a bit more? Yeah, Sarah. Of course, I've asked Elizabeth to say more because she can't actually verbally say that. But if you don't mind putting something in the chat, I'd be really interested to know more about it. And for those who don't have any particular questions now, is there anything else that, obviously that was a whistle stop tour, is there anything that was that you'd like to know more about or would want to think a bit more about? Okay, so Elizabeth's saying she's been working on like this over 6 years, especially good in the pandemic. Yeah. And I think the pandemic was a bit of a catalyst for some groups to think about the impact of nature and the absence of nature on their well-being. And certainly, I think the National Trust commissioned a study looking at that, and it's something that came up a couple of times for the participants, the young people that I was talking with in my study. So, Kathy, has this ever come up in my current role supporting parents? Yes, in a roundabout way. So I suppose because I've got an ear for it. So and maybe I leap on it a bit too much because it's such an interest of mine. So when parents talk about, so I've had a few parents who talk about so we talk about when are things okay? We're looking for our exceptions, and commonly it's like, well, when we're out on the beach, or when we're out for a walk in the woods, or when they go up. One family working had this lovely wooded space behind their house that they could go to. We have great chats when we're on the log. So I suppose what I do in that situation is I listen out for them and think about, okay, how can we grow that? Similar to what most of every EPs will be doing with exception finding and trying to kind of enhance that and seeing how can we use that in other situations. So Elizabeth's thinking about some good evidence with all ages, not evidence yet for younger ages. That's interesting. So I'd love to that. Yeah. And Owen saying 24. Sue, does being out in nature be conflated with outdoors education? It does, in the sense of trying to get through a database search, but I suppose no. So actually, a lot of what I'm coming across is that there's a clear distinction about using, I suppose, nature therapeutically. And then there's, I suppose, in those macro studies that I was talking about, they're talking about just access to nature, just nature being in the background. Outdoor education, there is quite a field of research, and a kind of, I suppose I put that in the same category as things like forest school. And And I think there's whole journal articles kind of devoted to outdoor education. And I suppose I've personally not dived into it because I'm particularly interested in young people in secondary schools in urban locations, and how we can enhance kind of those experiences. Because I suppose outdoors education seems to be thought of as different to or additional or something on top of. And what I'm particularly interested in is schools, everyday schools and secondary schools in particular, and how could we maybe make use of this in those contexts. So yeah. And thanks, Sarah. Is there something for children, young people about just being outside rather than stuck in a classroom? Yeah. And there's interesting, I suppose there's the evaluations of forest school. I mean, there are studies around that, but, and again, this is very impressionistic, so I haven't looked at that in great detail, because forest school tends to end in primary school, which again is interesting. And the evaluations tend to be about kind of this experience. They don't seem to be a lot of outcomes-based evaluations. Sorry, where was I going? Because the chat is changing, and so that's kind of distracting me. So I suppose anecdotally, the kind of the space, when I was asked to look into forest school, like with the nursery in the school that I was working with, I think one of the things is kind of maybe this, is it about the space? If you're looking at through I suppose a forest bathing Shirin Yoku perspective, is it about kind of what's around the trees? Apparently the kind of contact with trees helps regulate our cortisol. Or is it just about kind of the increased autonomy that can come with being in forest school? There's a lot of choice. Now this is just based on my experience as a parent, kind of observing forest school and supporting my kids' forest school. But I think there's something really interesting to be explored in that. And with all of this, there's that theme of kind of perception of risk and how play has changed. And I haven't really done a deep dive into that because that's a massive area. But alongside the discourse around, especially in Richard Lew's book, about how play, how our contact with nature has declined, so too is there perception of our perception of risk has increased. And so play has moved indoors, children are more supervised. Simon, I see you're on there. Simon, that was one of the things I always picked up from working with you, was kind of how our perception of risk has changed, over the years. So it leads on to all of these interesting kind of side discussions that you could really get lost down through. Okay. We've gone on a bit, Sarah. Is there anything else that I haven't, Sarah, that I haven't noticed in the chat that I haven't addressed, if you want to pop on? Oh, gardening. Yeah, so that's another way of thinking about. Yeah, so I can't wait to see how my research goes as well. What have I missed? Oh, sorry, Dr. Westington, have you done any research or know anyone work with children outdoors rather than inside? Yeah. So one of the links I have is I love a podcast, and so there are one of the podcasts it was a BBC One Discovery series, and they had some people on doing that very thing, so taking their therapy outdoors. So hopefully that kind of, there will be a link with there. But because I'm looking at it from I suppose a schools-based perspective, I was kind of thinking about things that can happen in schools, things that interventions that can be added within the school day, rather than thinking specifically about from a therapeutic aspect. But I'm sure there's a lot of work done out there. And one of the another person I've come across in these travels is but it's at an adult level, but NHS wellbeing. So it's through the NHS. She works so she offers wellbeing for just staff wellbeing, but she does it combining acceptance and commitment therapy, which is another fave of mine, and outdoors. So there is definitely people doing work that way. Okay, more messages. Sorry. Yeah, something. Yeah, that's why there's something problematic in the current research about connection. Yes, well, that is interesting, Lucy. Yeah, And this, yeah, so the sense of kind of, and that's what these, so the tools that measure nature connection look at whether we see, there is this kind of discourses that we're still separate, and that's where this idea of the commodification of nature and concerns about that come into it. And like some like I use that tool with the young people, and I haven't that are involved in my study, and this is no near ready yet, but one of the things I'm wondering is whether how they've rated themselves on the nature connectedness index is different to how they actually see themselves as in their discourse. So if I'm comparing the discourse and the interviews that I had with them versus how they've rated themselves in a questionnaire, would that actually still match up as being kind of as nature connected? Because they tend to see themselves being very connected to nature. And yeah, so some people are on very different places on that continuum. So this is some feedback. Oh, thanks, Sarah. She's could save the chat. Yeah, so being outside, finding it easy to talk, so that it kind of breaks up that dynamic. Oh gosh, there's loads more messages. By role modeling, parent carers, yeah. So Harriet, I'm thinking you're wondering about the link that what the experiences that you have as a child and what that leads to as an adult. And there is, some people have been looking at that link, but it's done kind of retrospectively. So I don't know whether that's been, say, proven, as if anything is ever proven in research, but when people have looked into that question, they've been looking at it from the perspective of kind of retrospective. But yeah, so I think there is some evidence to suggest that your experiences as a child, and that, again, that's been an interesting thing that's come up with the interviews I've had so far with the teenagers that I've met, is that mostly all of them recall having a lot more freedom, or having been taken somewhere as children, having no choice, and then kind of going away from nature in their mid-teens, and then coming back to it as they're coming out of their teens. Yeah, so there's something kind of interesting to that. I'm sorry if I've missed anybody's chat or questions as they're coming in. This is why face-to-face would have been so much better. But anyway, thoughts seeming clearer outside, and where my place in a bigger world. Yeah, so this is really interesting, Elizabeth. So that's why these comments that are coming from the people that you're supporting, I mean, that's definitely resonates with some of the comments that the young people that I've met, in terms of what they've noticed about being outside. They've noticed cognitive benefits, so things like I can think, it's easier to think, thoughts are clearer, and maybe that links with this idea of the attention restoration theory. Maybe that's where that comes into play there. There's less focus, the requirement for focused attention, so there's more headspace. There's also probably less about that dynamic about being face to face, and the pressure for, you know, an interview or a discussion, or that kind of one-to-one dynamic. I'm just aware that we're gone quite over. So yeah, thank you for coming, and thank you for all your questions. And sorry, we weren't able to get through kind of everything. Yeah, interesting comment, Simon. Thank you. And yeah, you'll be pleased to know your phrase about theory espoused versus theory and practice is coming back into my thinking as I look at my data as well. Yeah, and there's definitely things about, so a lot of the research is kind of from kind of Western areas. So Lucy, the perception of relationship with nature could be very, very different in different cultures, and that idea of nature connectedness could vary very greatly. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Simon. Bye, Sue.